You're here, listening, in the dark, I guess. I'm not sure if I should tell you these stories, but since you're already here, tell me, where are you right now? And what time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I hope you're not alone, because, after this, you might wish you were. No one had expected a corpse to arrive that morning. No reports had predicted it. No weather had warned of it. But there it had been, sprawled face down against the wrought iron gate of Wren Hill Cemetery, bathed in the golden haze of sunrise. He had been discovered by a child, Lena, age 10, who had peered through her bedroom window, expecting birds and instead found flesh. The gate had held him like a cradle, arms limp, belly pressed firm against cold iron, skin pale as driftwood. No wounds had been visible, no clothing had been worn, no identifiers had been found. The police had arrived quietly, a stretcher had been brought, photos had been taken, but nothing about the man had made sense. No matches in any national or regional missing persons databases, no signs of struggle or self-harm, no scent, no blood, just stillness. The medical examiner, Dr. Malden, whose name carried more authority in autopsy than compassion, had made the first joke. He had called the man Marlowe, not for a name, but for his shape, short, soft, and oddly bloated, like unbaked dough rising in summer heat. The staff had laughed nervously, only because they had seen the look in Malden's eyes, the tightness, the kind that never appeared unless something inside him had been shaken loose. And it had been because Marlowe's organs had been pristine, lungs pink, liver smooth, heart intact, every artery clear, every structure textbook perfect. Yet still he had been undeniably, irreversibly dead. Only one anomaly had been recorded during the examination. His jaw had moved, just slightly, just enough to cause the teeth to click together, like an involuntary shiver in winter. The movement had occurred while the chest cavity had been opened, while the heart had been removed and weighed, while death had already been declared. The sound had been faint, too faint for anyone but Malden to hear clearly. It had repeated every 30 to 40 minutes, always the same, 3 or 4 quick clatters, then silence, as if something inside him had been trying and failing to form words. Despite the unease, Marlowe had been placed into cold storage. A drawer labeled Uninanium, WMEST, 30s had held him without incident. The case had remained open but inactive. The footage from the surrounding area had shown him sprinting into the cemetery from a blind alley just before dawn. His pace had been unsettling, not just fast but wrong, like a body moving faster than it should. Lumbering, yet too efficient. No entry had been seen into the alley, only an exit, as if he had formed within it. The alley itself had been searched. Nothing unusual had been found, except a storm drain cover, slightly ajar. Beneath it, an inspection team had found nothing of relevance, except a circle, drawn in red chalk, too deliberate to be vandalism, and within that circle, seed shells, hundreds of them, sunflower, each one licked clean, each one laid with methodical precision. No other evidence had been gathered. No link had been made. Eventually the investigation had grown cold. Marlowe had been forgotten. Years had passed. Lena had grown. The gate had been replaced. The story had become folklore, dinner table material, until a notice had arrived. Marlowe's body must be removed. Storage rotation, funding issues, policy compliance. Burial had been authorized. The cemetery had handled its own dead. It had always done so. And that summer Marlowe had been placed into a simple wooden coffin, light, untreated, nailed shut by hand. He had been lowered into the northeast quadrant, an unmarked section reserved for the unknown and unclaimed. The earth had closed over him, the records had been sealed, and for 3 weeks, all had been quiet. Then the animals had arrived. At first, just a few, mangy, limping, silent, seen at dusk, loitering near the northeast fence, sniffing, waiting. Then more had come, just cats or dogs, but everything: raccoons, opossums, Foxes, even crows perched low and unblinking, together, but never fighting, never feeding, just watching, and always gathering around the same grave. Efforts to scare them away had failed. No sounds had startled them, no lights had deterred them. They had dug together in shifts, as if coordinated by something unseen. One morning a patch of soil had been disturbed. A black ridge had emerged, round, gnarled, and vaguely organic. It had not resembled root or stone. It had pulsed faintly, as though something beneath had exhaled. When approached, the ground had trembled lightly, not from movement, from response. A caretaker Hollis had found it first. He had circled it slowly, unsure if he was looking at a tumor of the earth or something planted. He had knelt. He had leaned closer. He had noticed something embedded in the side. A curved shape, semi-translucent, keratin, like a nail. The surface had been touched with caution. The nail-like growth had resisted pressure, slightly elastic yet firm, embedded not in wood or bone but in flesh that felt like soil. No heat had radiated from it. No cold either. Just a neutral, unsettling neutrality. The caretaker Hollis had recoiled instinctively, not from fear, from recognition, the kind that precedes conscious thought. Samples had been taken. The strange root had been photographed. Calls had been made. The grave had not been disturbed officially, but the digging animals had continued each night. Motion sensors had failed. Cameras had captured only static where the soil pulsed. And by the time investigators had returned, the growth had changed shape. It had expanded outward. What had once looked like a potato gone wrong now resembled something more deliberate. A pod, veined, ridged, covered in hair-fine crimson tendrils that threaded back into the earth in every direction. It had no smell, no movement, but the clicking had returned. Not from beneath, not from the animals, from the ground itself. Faint, rhythmic, consistent. A decision had been made. The area must be quarantined. Not officially, not yet, but men in dark uniforms had been stationed at each entrance to the cemetery by midnight. Lights had been erected. Noise deterrents had been installed. None of it had mattered. The animals had persisted, drawn by something no frequency could mask. They had dug with purpose. Then came the bloom. In the middle of the third week, the growth had split. Not ruptured, peeled, like the slow opening of wet fabric. A seam had formed down the center of the pod. Inside, fibrous muscle, wet and reddish purple, twitching gently in time with the clicking beneath the soil. Something had grown inside that wasn't meant to be unearthed. Or perhaps, it had always been meant to be unearthed. The fingernail had been joined by more 3, 4, maybe 5 growing in a circular arc around the base of the bloom. Their positions suggested a hand. The presence around the cemetery had thickened, not visually, not physically, but atmospherically. The air had felt denser. The space between each tree had seemed narrower, as if everything had leaned in. Even time had warped slightly. Caretakers had begun reporting odd clocks, alarms chiming early, shadows moving faster than expected. No sleep had come easily, and during waking hours, a name had been heard, not in sound, but in thought. Not Marlowe, something older, more layered. A series of syllables that refused to stay remembered. The government agents had arrived without ceremony. Black vans, no emblems, equipment too complex to be explained. The bloom had been measured, prod scanned, samples had been extracted and taken away. They had returned hours later, whispering among themselves with faces that betrayed nothing but tension. The soil had been cordoned off. No burial allowed, no contact permitted. Only one rule issued silently: watch, do not disturb. But watching had not helped, because it had already begun to spread. At the base of neighboring graves, tiny crimson sprouts had appeared, barely visible, barely pulsing, like roots reaching sideways in secret. A network, a body growing itself across the dead. Then, in the early hours of a fog-heavy morning, Hollis had gone missing. His whistle had been found near the original site, still warm, still damp. No footprints had been left behind, only a trail of sunflower seed shells, forming a line to the center of the growth. The seeds had been dry, clean, fresh, and in the air a new sound had arrived, the chattering of teeth, but not human, not canine, something deeper, faster, longer. At home, Lena had begun waking in the night, not in fear, but in alignment, as if something buried long ago had reached up and pressed against her window. Not with fingers, but with thought. The birds had started flying into the glass, not by accident, by design, over and over, until their necks had snapped, until blood had pooled against the frame, and in their feathers, stuck between gore and glass, sunflower seeds had been found, still warm, still clean. That night her mother, caretaker and record keeper of Wren Hill, had gone to the cemetery to confront whatever had been growing beneath the surface. She had found something not there the night before. A face, faint, stretched beneath the membrane of the bloom, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, and behind it, something tapped against the inside of the flesh. A rhythm, not a heartbeat, not a struggle, but a call. The face beneath the membrane had not changed for hours. Eyes remained closed, mouth remained slightly parted. The shape of the skull had pushed gently against the tissue, giving it the look of something midway through birth. No breath had been measured, no heat had radiated, but movement had persisted, slow pulses, as if the creature were breathing with the earth rather than lungs. And always, the sound beneath the grave had continued, clicking, whispering, a pattern beyond language. An emergency perimeter had been formed. Local authorities had been removed from the site. Agents in black gear had arrived to replace them, this time equipped with long-case instruments and helmets that never came off. The bloom had been sealed under a portable dome. No one had been told what it measured, what it emitted, only that no direct eye contact with the face should be made again. The animals had not obeyed. They had continued arriving. They had begun howling, screeching, crying. Some had thrown themselves against the barrier. Others had simply gathered and stared, silent as tombs. Even insects had changed their patterns. Nocturnal species now active by day. Bees and moths circling the dome like satellites. Wasps burrowing into the ground nearby and disappearing beneath the surface. Beneath the dome, the bloom had altered again. A second opening had formed, lower, rounder, rimmed with faint indentations like teeth. The structure no longer resembled a plant, or a fungus, or a tumor. It resembled a mouth slowly shaping itself beneath the grave, and from that mouth, the chattering had grown sharper. Not louder, more focused, like a signal being tuned with exquisite precision. That night, Mr. Norrick, the last groundskeeper still stationed near the site, had disappeared. His final report had mentioned shadows appearing too quickly, corners feeling sharper than before. He had described seeing fingernails in the gravel, not dropped, pushing upward. His flashlight had been found half buried the next morning, still on. Its lens had been cracked from the inside. Meanwhile, the chattering had begun to take on tone. Not human, not digital, but musical in the sense that it followed rhythm, repetition, escalation. Technicians had tried to record it. The audio had always been corrupted. Each file, when opened, had played laughter instead. Wet, breathy, uneven. Not hysterical, not joyful, just delighted. The seeds had spread, not just in the cemetery, now in gutters, on rooftops, stuck in the mouths of dead birds. Sunflower seeds, dry and white, had been found beneath pillows, between floorboards, inside locked glove compartments, and always in groups of 12. The family had been placed under home lockdown. Lena, her mother, Dr. Malden, all confined by silent men who spoke through earpieces and gave no orders beyond remain inside. Windows had been covered with black film. Doors had been fitted with new locks. Still, the seeds had appeared inside the toilet tank, pressed against the inside of the microwave door, once even caught between the pages of a children's book. At night, the mirrors had started to fog, despite the house being kept at constant cool temperature, and behind that mist, faces had flickered. Not Marlowe, not copies of anyone known. Faces stretched and flattened, shaped like screaming masks but with eyes that did not close. And in the reflection, one word had appeared, risen. On the cemetery grounds, new structures had begun forming, not visibly, not tangibly, But in the grass, circles had appeared, burned faintly into the blades, always 12 feet wide, always perfectly round. No cause could be traced, no heat source, no chemicals, and beneath each circle, recordings had picked up the same rhythm. Click, click, pause, click, click, a language of movement, an alphabet of teeth. The dome had finally failed at dawn, not through breach. It had peeled like the bloom itself, not torn, not broken, just opened, split down the middle, edges curled outward. Inside, the bloom had hardened, its surface now calcified, ridged like ancient bone. The face had receded, only the teeth had remained, hundreds of them, set in a spiral, facing outward, smiling upward, and from beneath it, a voice had emerged, not spoken, emitted, a clicking so fast, so layered, it had begun to sound like breath. One agent had dropped his gear and fled, the others had not moved. They had turned in perfect unison toward the cemetery chapel, and began walking, not marching, drifting, as though pulled by roots wrapped around their bones. Inside the chapel, the windows had cracked one by one, from within, and beneath the floorboards, the laughter had begun again. The chapel had remained silent for years. No services had been held, no candles lit. Its foundation had sunk slightly into the soil, leaving faint cracks along the eastern wall. But when the agents had entered, something had answered, not with movement, not with light, with scent. The air had filled with the smell of damp earth and sweet rot, like mulch over flesh, like cut flowers that had stayed too long in still water. Inside the chapel, the pews had splintered without sound. Dust had drifted downward, despite no one touching it. A low sound, half breath, half ticking, had begun under the floorboards, and beneath it all, the seed, sunflower husks, clean and pale, had been laid out in a ring along the perimeter of the altar, their arrangement too exact to be accidental, each one pointed inward, toward a shallow hollow in the center of the stone. Inside that hollow, a small, wet object, a tooth, still pulsing. Outside, the soil at Marlowe's grave had begun to breathe, not metaphorically. It had risen and fallen as if lungs had been buried there, as if something not only alive, but aware had settled beneath the surface and was preparing to stand. The bloom had calcified into a complete spiral. No petals remained, only teeth, and from between those teeth, small spines had begun to emerge. They resembled fingers, but they tapped the air like antennae. Each one curled, retracted, stretched, searching, measuring, claiming. In the house, the family had begun to change, not in body, in behavior. Lina had stopped blinking. Her mother had begun humming without realizing. Dr. Malden had not left the basement in 4 days, and all of them had dreamed in teeth, not symbols, not nightmares, just rows and rows of teeth, clicking in sequences that matched the sounds beneath the floor. Each night more birds had died. Each morning, the sunflower seeds had appeared in patterns, under chairs, beside faucets, inside shoes, always 12, never more, never less. At noon on the 7th day, the chapel's roof had collapsed inward. No explosion, no decay, just surrender. Beneath the shattered beams, a new shape had emerged, tall, wet, asymmetrical, not human, but draped in suggestion. A face had taken shape across its chest. Not one face, many, pressed together like wax melted into wax. Eyes, mouths, cheeks, all silent, all chattering. The agents had stopped reporting. Their vehicles had remained outside the cemetery untouched. Their radios had been found filled with seed shells. Their boots had been arranged around the growth in a perfect circle. No footprints had led away, only indentations, as though the soil had swallowed them from below. The animals had vanished, gone entirely. No birds, no foxes, no stray dogs, only burrows, dozens of them, leading inward from all directions, and beneath the topsoil, bones, clean, orderly, as if the earth had been given instructions. In the final report, never released, filed under restricted access, a single observation had been entered by hand. The body was never a body. The grave was never a grave. The cemetery was never for the dead. On the 13th day, the house had gone silent. Windows had clouded. Doors had sealed.
The mirrors had turned dark. Inside them, Lena's reflection had stopped moving, even as she walked, even as she slept, and in the glass, her mouth had moved on its own, forming a word no one had taught her. Not Marlowe, not a name, a summons. Across town, sunflower seeds had begun appearing in kitchen drains, inside children's backpacks, tucked into laundry machines. People had started hearing clicks in the pipes, in their walls, in their beds. Some had opened their mouths in their sleep and found shells inside when they woke. Others had stopped waking at all. Weeks later, the cemetery had been fenced off with steel. No trespassing signs had been posted, but the fence had done nothing, because whatever had grown there, whatever had risen, no longer required a place. It required people, not to kill, to root through, to echo through, to finish what it had started long ago, when teeth had first touched earth. Now in every silence, it waited, and in every still night it spoke, not in words, in chat.
The gates had been taller than remembered. Flaked paint peeled from the iron like dead skin. Behind them, the courtyard stretched wide, an expanse of pavement scorched under years of late summer sun, bordered by hedges, trimmed not by care, but habit. It had been the first day, not of school, but of exposure. His name had been Elias, but it had not mattered. Names had not protected anyone here. Only alignment, smiles, and the quiet art of invisibility. He had walked inside as though entering a temple, not out of reverence, but fear. Fear of being seen, fear of not being seen enough. And behind him, the gates had closed. The first laugh had been light, not cruel, not sharp, but enough to draw blood beneath the skin. His tongue had faltered. His throat had closed. The stutter had arrived like an old enemy, dragging with it the weight of forgotten mockery. And from that day forward, Elias had become the joke. Year after year, name after name, until the name was replaced altogether. They had called him Splinter, then Patch, then worse. He had stopped listening after that. 3 of them had stood at the center of it all. Girls with perfect posture, perfect faces, and perfect cruelties. They had laughed in angles, mockery hidden beneath charm. They had known how to humiliate without leaving bruises, and they had done it well. Photos had been found, edited, spread. Drawings had appeared in notebooks, lockers, bathroom stalls. His childhood weaponized, clothes had been yanked down, milk and cheese. His worst allergy had been poured over his back on a walk home. They had laughed like witches. The school had done nothing. Protecting their image had mattered more than protecting a boy with a crumbling voice. There had been weeks of silence sometimes, weeks where he had almost believed it was over. Then the laughter had returned, louder, until the silence inside him had cracked, and he had begun to listen to something else. By the final year, something had shifted. One of them, Lyra, the one with the watchful eyes, had approached him, not to mock, but to speak. She had smiled, apologized, said something about regret. He had believed her. He had wanted to. Time had passed. The group had stopped. For the first time he had existed without fear. They had spoken more, laughed, shared secrets. She had said she used to bully him because she had liked him. The absurdity of it had made him dizzy, but the affection had been real. They had dated. 4 months. Soft moments, hushed kisses. The kind of love only survivors believe in. He had smiled again, for a while. Then the whisper had come, not in sound, in the wall. A voice that hadn't belonged to anyone human. One that knew his name in a way no one else had ever spoken it. With weight, with understanding. It had said, 4 days. Nothing more. And everything after that had been inevitable. The second day had begun with a tremble in the walls. Not an earthquake, not a draft, just a subtle shift. Like old wood rearranging itself to listen better. Elias had returned home in silence. No music, no backdrop, only stillness. His room had smelled like dust and something older. He had felt watched, not from above or behind, but from within.
The whisper had returned, not spoken into the air. It had slid into his mind as though it had always lived there, and it had named her, Lyra, then the others, Sierra and Marin, each syllable pronounced without breath, each name weighted like an anchor tied to memory. The closet door had been cracked open, not by accident, inside a phone. Not his. He had known whose it had been, the familiar casing, the charm dangling from the corner. What had been seen on the screen had not needed sound. Messages, photos, plans, not for parties, for cruelty. Lyra's name beside each message, smiling while orchestrating the downfall she claimed to regret. Words like humiliate, film, destroy, attached to his face. His name, the relationship had been a stage. The love, a lie stretched too tight. The whisper had instructed him then, look under the bed. The object found had not been a weapon. It had been a bottle, half full, sharp on the throat. But the moment it had entered him, something had shifted. His tongue had felt smooth, his breath calm. The stutter had vanished, not suppressed, removed. The voice had smiled within him, not heard, felt, something ancient and patient. The rest had followed in ritual, not madness, awakening. A car had been unlocked with shaking hands, a home entered, a meal altered. Elias had hidden beneath the bed. He had listened to breathing, waited until it had slowed, then moved. Ropes had been tied, salt had been sprinkled, smelling salts held beneath nostrils to force them awake. 3 shapes in a row, mother, father, sister, bound, silent. Then Marin, eyes wide, mouth sealed. The whisper had guided his hand. Each act had been done slowly, with intention, with meaning. The glue on the eyelids had dried quickly. None of them could blink. None could look away. The fork had not been sharp, but it had done its job. Eyes removed, placed inside a blender, pulsed into paste. The sound had been musical, and Marin had watched it all. Her screams caught behind cloth, her body shaking without control. The tape had been ripped away. Words had come out. Useless. The pipe inserted. The mixture poured. Her family had been returned to her as penance. She had been left with silence, and the certainty that it had all been her fault. On the 3rd day, Sierra had been chosen. Another visit, another rope, another ceremony. This time, not death, confession, recorded, amplified, forced. The boy, her brother, had told everything, tears soaking the tape, eyes refusing to close. He had been freed, a single shot, fast, blooming red across the wall. His body had fallen like a flower cut from its root. Sierra had screamed, begged, not for mercy, for death. But mercy had not been offered, only reminders. The whisper had smiled again. Each act had been one brick further from humanity, one brick closer to something truer. The video had been saved, ready for the final night. The 4th day had dawned with quiet skies. No wind, no birds, only stillness, like the world had been waiting. Elias had walked through the day with practiced calm. No one had noticed, not the shopkeeper, not the strangers passed on the street. The world had looked ordinary, only he had been changed. Leona, formerly Lyra, had laughed that afternoon. They had spent the day together, smiling, drinking something cold beneath a quiet sky. Her voice had sparkled, her fingers had brushed his arm. She had not known, not yet. That night, the ritual had repeated. Another meal, another dosage, another house slipping into silence. Her parents had been bound first, then Leona. Her wrists had been tied with precision, her mouth covered, her eyes left free. She had awoken in darkness, lit only by flickering candles. The air had smelled of gasoline. She had not spoken, but her eyes had said everything. Fear, confusion, recognition, and then betrayal. Elias had stood before her, still, calm, not smiling, not angry either, just done. He had struck the match slowly. Her parents had been drenched, clothing soaked, hair heavy with fuel. The flame had been dropped without hesitation, and they had burned without sound, not screams, just the hiss of fabric and skin and air being devoured. The house had followed soon after, dry wood catching like memory, walls folding inward, ash curling into the sky. Leona had been dragged outside, her face streaked with tears, her mouth now uncovered. She had watched her childhood dissolve, Her lineage turned to smoke. Then the final act had been played. The phone screen had glowed. A video had loaded. Sierra now just remains of a person sobbing on her knees. The remains of a pet charred, mutilated before her, forced to eat. The sound had been unbearable. Leona had broken at the sight, collapsed into dirt, clutching herself. And then the words had come, not from Elias, from the voice inside him. Words not in language, but in truth. This was never about revenge. It had always been about correction. He had left her there, not dead, not free, but transformed. The fourth day had ended. No sound had come from the whisper, no command, no new name, just silence. And it had been worse than the voice itself. Elias had waited. The wall where it once spoke had been struck with a hammer. Each swing, desperate, wood and plaster exploding into splinters. Behind the wall, nothing, only beams, dust, empty space. The closet empty, the bed broken, the air heavy. The whisper had gone, and Elias had fallen to his knees in the ruin he had created, chest heaving, face pressed into the wall, as if begging the silence to answer. It hadn't. Weeks had passed. No arrests, no sirens, no headlines, only rumors,
and eventually, only forgetting. Elias had disappeared from the narrative, until one day, he had reappeared, volunteering, calm, helpful. The psych ward had welcomed him with open arms. No one had questioned his sudden desire to work with the broken. No one had recognized the name, except one. Leona had been admitted in pieces, not physically, mentally, spiritually, unresponsive at first, then trembling, then screaming through nights that never seemed to end, medicated, restrained, isolated, and then slowly functional. Only when he had appeared, she had not recognized him at first, until the questions had begun. Math problems whispered in her ear, equations left on her tray, puzzles that made no sense, until they did, until she realized every answer brought her closer to remembering, and every mistake brought a punishment. Psychological, precise, silent. No one else had noticed. Only she had known what he was doing, and he had watched her every day, fed her, groomed her hair, smiled, and reminded her, with every kind gesture, "You made me, you made this, you are never going to wake up from what you started." Elias had never raised a hand, never screamed, never touched her with violence, but every word whispered into her mind at night, every number scribbled on her food tray, every memory he reactivated, had been far worse, because she had not been tormented. She had been preserved, frozen in the memory of everything she had done, everything she had lost, everything he had become because of her. And outside her window, just beyond the rusted bars, sunflower seeds had begun to appear on the windowsill. Then 3, then 12,